The words still ring in my ears, sharp and merciless like shards of broken glass. "You're uneducated trash." My father's voice cut through the air, each syllable designed to carve me out of existence, to brand me with shame I had spent years trying to shake off. My mother didn't hesitate. Before his words had even settled into the silence, she added her own venom. "Get lost. You're a nobody." She said it with a firmness that told me this wasn't anger, this was truth in her eyes. Her voice cracked slightly, though, like even she knew she had stepped too far, but pride wouldn't allow her to step back. I remember staring at the chipped linoleum floor beneath my shoes, following the jagged lines in the pattern, trying to focus on something other than the weight of their rejection. The air between us was so thick, heavy, with years of silent judgment and unspoken rivalries, that it felt like I was suffocating. I could taste salt at the back of my throat, but it wasn't from tears. It was from holding back every truth I had ever swallowed just to keep this family intact, every time I had chosen silence over screaming, just to be tolerated, every sacrifice they had conveniently forgotten. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was the life I had built in the shadows of their disdain. No, I didn't have diplomas hanging on the wall like my siblings. I didn't have the career milestones they could brag about to their friends at dinner parties. But in my bank account, quiet, hidden, untouchable, I had $60 million. Every cent earned with deliberate patience, every investment carefully chosen, every risk calculated, while they called me a failure to my face. I had built an empire they could never have imagined, precisely because they had never looked at me closely enough to wonder what I was capable of. That night, I didn't argue. I didn't scream back or beg them to see me differently. I simply nodded as though acknowledging their verdict and walked toward the door. The winter air outside bit into my skin, sharp and unforgiving, but it was nothing compared to the frost in that living room. As I started my car, the muffled sound of my mother's voice reached me. Not to call me back, not to apologize, but to make sure the neighbors knew she was right. That was all that mattered to her. Appearances, reputation, winning the story. By the time I reached the edge of town, their front porch light a shrinking shadow in my rearview mirror, I had already decided. Tomorrow I wouldn't just leave. I would vanish into a world they couldn't touch. A world they didn't even believe I was worthy to glimpse. That night I stood barefoot on the balcony of my Florida beachfront mansion. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, waves kissing the white sand below, the salt air curling through my hair. Behind me, the house hummed with quiet activity staff, preparing breakfast coffee, brewing the faint clinking of dishes. Every detail of that home, from the Italian chandeliers above to the hand-carved mahogany doors, had been chosen by me. This was my sanctuary, my fortress, my reward for years of swallowing their insults in silence. I turned my phone over in my hand, its screen lighting up with missed calls and unread messages. Not from my parents, of course. They believed I was probably sleeping in my car by now, desperate and broken. Instead, I opened my private banking app, the numbers glowing back at me with quiet defiance, proof of every night I had spent reading market charts while they told me I would never make it. Proof of every calculated risk I had taken in tech startups, property flips, investments in brilliant people who had only needed a chance. I had learned early that real power wasn't loud. It wasn't brash or flashy. It was silent, precise, patient. And now that silence was my greatest weapon. Within days, the first ripple began. My cousin Mia texted me asking, "Where are you living now?" I heard something crazy. Crazy, that's how my family always described anything they couldn't understand. Anything that didn't fit the neat little box they had shoved me into, where I was always the failure, the disappointment, the one who never measured up. I typed back just 2 words: Florida coast. No emoji, no explanation, just enough to ignite curiosity. That evening, I could already feel the shift. My brother's fiancé liked a photo on my private Instagram account. A neighbor from my parents' street who had never dared to acknowledge me before suddenly sent me a friend request. Small cracks in their carefully curated narrative of me as the nobody. And then came the call. My father. His name lit up on the screen like an omen. I didn't answer. Didn't. The next morning, I sat at the edge of my infinity pool, the water lapping against my legs, while the housekeeper unpacked a crate of art pieces I had kept in storage. One painting caught my eye, an oil rendering of a storm breaking over the sea. The light caught it in a way that felt almost prophetic. I thought of my parents sitting in their cramped living room, their self-righteousness wrapped around them like a threadbare blanket, never realizing that the child they called a nobody had built a life that eclipsed theirs in every possible way. But the truth about family is this: you can't stay invisible forever. Sooner or later, they come looking. And when they do, they don't come out of love. They come out of need. It wasn't my parents who showed up first. It was my brother, Adam. I spotted him from the balcony before the front gates even opened, leaning against his car, with the same smirk he wore at every family gathering. The smirk that said he thought he was smarter than everyone else in the room. The security guard called me ma'am. He says he's family. I told him to let Adam wait 10 minutes before I came down. When I finally walked out to meet him, he looked around, masking his shock with a casual shrug. Nice place, he said, as though it could all be his with the right words. He tried to act concerned, telling me Mom and Dad wanted to talk. But his eyes betrayed him, darting across the terrace, lingering on the view, calculating. He couldn't hide the envy. I let him squirm under the silence before I finally said what we both knew. No, Adam. They don't want to see me. They want to see what I have. His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Before he left, he muttered something about me coming back for dinner sometime. I smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. Maybe. But next time, tell them to come themselves. I'm done sending updates through a messenger. That was the beginning of the tide turning. Because if Adam had seen this place, my parents wouldn't be far behind. And sure enough, they came. They didn't announce their visit. They never had the humility for that. Instead, one morning I woke to the buzzing of the intercom, 2 people at the gate. They say they're your parents. For a moment I froze. My hands shook as I held the phone, the weight of years pressing against me. They hadn't come when I was broken. They hadn't come when they had screamed me out of their home with nothing but cruelty. But now, after whispers had reached them, after Adam's smugness had betrayed more than words could say, they had come. I walked to the window and looked down at the long drive where their old sedan sat parked so out of place against the sleek lines of the estate. My father was already out of the car, arms crossed, his posture rigid like a soldier who still believed he was in command. My mother clutched her handbag close, her eyes darting around, already measuring, already judging. I told the guard to let them wait. 20 minutes passed before I walked down. Every step across the marble floor echoed like thunder in my chest. When I finally opened the massive carved doors, the Florida sunlight poured in, framing me in a way that felt almost cinematic. My mother's mouth opened slightly as she took in the entryway, the chandeliers, the polished stone. My father, though, didn't flinch. His eyes flicked once across the view, then back to me, as if pretending he wasn't impressed would undo the truth. Well, he said finally, voice flat, you've done well for yourself. Those words, meant to sound neutral, carried more bitterness than acknowledgement. My mother, however, was already stepping forward, her voice sweetened like honey left too long in the sun. We were worried about you, she said. You disappeared. You didn't answer calls. We thought maybe something happened. I let out a small laugh. You thought something happened? The last words you said to me were, get lost. You're a nobody. Did you worry then? Her face stiffened, but she pressed on. We were angry. Families fight. You can't hold on to those words forever. I stepped aside, letting them into the foyer, watching as their eyes flickered across the art on the walls. The staircase that curved like a ribbon, the glimpse of the ocean beyond the glass doors. They wanted to appear unaffected, but I could feel their hunger in the way they lingered. I poured coffee for them in the sunlit kitchen, and we sat at the long oak table. It should have felt like reconciliation, but instead it felt like a negotiation. My father leaned back in his chair, his voice even. Your brother mentioned you've been successful. We didn't realize. Of course you didn't, I replied. You never looked at me long enough to wonder what I was capable of. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. My mother finally sighed, pressing a hand to her temple. We were hard on you, she said. But it was for your own good. We wanted you to be strong. No, I said quietly, my voice cutting through her excuses. You wanted me to be silent. There's a difference. For the first time, my father's gaze faltered. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. I realized then that this wasn't an apology. It was a reconnaissance mission. They weren't here to mend anything, they were here to measure what they could gain. And when my mother finally asked the question, "Do you really live here alone?" It must be hard to manage all this without family. I knew I was right. That night after they left, with polite smiles and empty promises to keep in touch, I stood alone on the balcony watching the horizon bleed into dusk. My chest burned with a mixture of rage and grief. For years I had fantasized about this moment, the day they would finally see me, acknowledge me, maybe even regret what they had done. But the reality was hollow. They hadn't come out of love. They had come out of curiosity. And yet their visit lit something inside me. Not a longing, not anymore, but a fire. They had tried to erase me, to define me as nothing. Now I had the chance to define myself, not just for me, but for the world. I began to plan. The first step was subtle. I funded scholarships under an alias, programs for kids like me, those overlooked, dismissed, called nobodies by the people who should have lifted them up. Each check I signed felt like defiance against the narrative my parents had written for me. Then came the bigger moves. I invested in properties not far from my parents' neighborhood, anonymous purchases at first, then quiet renovations that turned rundown houses into jewels. Slowly, their street began to change, their neighbors whispering about the mysterious benefactor reshaping the block. When the day came that a glossy magazine published a feature on me, my name, my face, my story, there was no hiding it anymore. My parents' friends, their church, their community, all of them read the words, "From trash to triumph, the woman who built a fortune after being cast out by her own family." The calls began again. This time, not just from my parents, but from cousins, aunts, old neighbors who once ignored me. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. Everyone wanted access. I let the phone ring. But fate is cruel, and it twists the knife when you least expect it. One evening, as I returned from a gala where I had been honored for philanthropy, my phone buzzed with a message from Adam. "Mom's sick. Dad says come, please." I sat in the car dress, glittering under the city lights, hands shaking as I read the words. My first instinct was disbelief. Was this another ploy? Another manipulation? But something in Adam's message felt raw, stripped of arrogance. For the first time in years, he hadn't been the messenger of their demands. He was their child, asking for help. I didn't reply. I just told the driver to take me to the hospital. When I arrived, the sterile white corridors smelled of disinfectant and fear. My mother lay in a bed, tubes running from her arms, her face pale and drawn. My father sat beside her, older than I remembered, the weight of his pride etched into the lines of his face. For a moment, I just stood there, the past and present colliding in a way that made it hard to breathe. My mother's eyes fluttered open. She looked at me, her lips trembling, but no words came. My father rose slowly, his gaze locked on mine. "You came," he said simply. I nodded. I came. And in that moment, I wasn't sure if I had come to forgive or to witness. The room was heavy with unspoken words, the kind that hung in the air like smoke after a fire. I stood at the foot of my mother's bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest, the faint beeping of machines marking each fragile second. My father hovered beside her, his posture still rigid, but there was something in his eyes I had never seen before. Not pride, not disdain, something closer to fear. I pulled the chair closer and sat, my hands folded in my lap. My mother's gaze drifted to me, and for the first time in years, she didn't look at me with judgment. She looked at me as though she wasn't sure if I was real, as though she was half afraid I might vanish if she blinked. Her lips parted. Her voice, hoarse and thin, barely made it past the oxygen mask. "You came." The words pierced me. How could she be surprised? How could she not see that, despite everything, I still carried a thread of loyalty to the woman who had given me life, even if she had spent years trying to strip me of its worth? "I came," I answered quietly, "but I don't know why." My father flinched, his jaw tightening. "She's your mother. That should be enough." I turned to him, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that surprised even me. "She's the one who told me to get lost. You're the one who called me trash. And now you expect me to just Forget. He didn't reply. His silence said more than words ever could. For the first time, he couldn't command the room with his voice. The doctors came in checking vitals, murmuring about surgery recovery risk. I watched it all unfold, my mind torn between two truths: the child in me who still wanted her mother to live, and the woman in me who knew survival sometimes meant letting go of the people who had poisoned you the most. When they wheeled her out for testing, my father sat heavily in the chair beside me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then, in a voice rougher than I'd ever heard, he said, "You built something. We know. We've seen." The admission startled me. He never admitted anything. Not failure, not fault, not even fact. And I asked. And maybe we were wrong. He said it quickly as if the words burned his tongue. I leaned forward, my voice low and sharp. Maybe you were wrong. That's all. After years of tearing me down, after casting me out, after calling me nothing, you think maybe. He closed his eyes, his hands gripping the arms of the chair until his knuckles whitened. I don't know how to say it. That's because you don't want to, I replied. The nurse interrupted, then announcing my mother would be out of testing soon. My father stood and walked to the window, his back to me. It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get, and it wasn't enough. In the weeks that followed, my mother's health improved. I visited not daily, but enough for the whispers to begin among extended family. She came back, they said. She forgave. But the truth was far messier. I hadn't forgiven. I had only chosen not to abandon her in her weakest moment the way she had abandoned me in mine. Every visit she tried to bridge the gap with small talk, asking about the weather, about trivial things. But she never spoke of the night they cast me out. She never spoke of the words that had cut so deep I could still feel the scars. She never said, "I'm sorry." One evening, as I prepared to leave, she reached for my hand. Her fingers trembled against mine. "I don't want to fight anymore," she whispered. I looked down at her fragile frame, at the woman who had been both mother and executioner. "Then don't," I said simply, and I left. Outside the hospital, I sat in my car staring at the dashboard. The storm inside me had no name. Was it pity? Was it love? Or was it the remnants of hope still clinging, despite everything? I hated that part of me. The part that still longed for parents who would never exist. Back at my estate, Camille came to visit. She listened quietly as I poured everything out: the hospital, the words, the confusion that gnawed at me. She placed her hand on mine and said, "You don't owe them forgiveness. You don't owe them anything. But if you choose to give it, let it be on your terms, not theirs." Her words rooted in me. For the first time, I realized forgiveness wasn't a gift for them. It was a release for me. But I wasn't ready yet. When my mother was discharged, the family insisted on a dinner to celebrate. Against my better judgment, I went. The house was the same as the night they had thrown me out, same chipped linoleum, same stiff furniture. But something was different. This time I wasn't there as the girl they dismissed. I was there as the woman who had built an empire. My father sat at the head of the table, his voice booming as he tried to reclaim authority. My brother and cousins laughed too loudly at his jokes. My mother smiled weakly, still pale from recovery. And I sat quietly sipping my wine, watching them perform their version of family. Then halfway through the meal, my father cleared his throat. "We should put the past behind us," he said, his tone commanding. "We are a family, that's all that matters." I set my glass down slowly. "No," I said. The room fell silent. Family isn't about blood. Family is about who shows up when you're on the edge of losing everything. And when I was there, none of you came. My mother's fork clattered against her plate. My father's face darkened. "You're still holding on to that night," he growled. I met his gaze without flinching. "That night made me. It showed me exactly who I was to you. And it showed me who I never wanted to be." The silence that followed was deafening. I stood laying my napkin neatly on the table. "Enjoy your dinner," I said. And I walked out, the sound of my heels echoing like finality. In the car ride home, I cried not out of sadness, but out of release. For the first time I had said it. I had spoken the truth aloud in the very house where I had been silenced. It didn't heal the wounds, but it reminded me that the power was mine now, not theirs. The drive back to my estate that night felt different from all the others. The road stretched long and quiet headlights cutting through the darkness. I kept replaying the dinner scene in my mind. My father's thunderous silence, my mother's trembling fork, the way every cousin had stared at their plate, as though the truth on my lips might swallow them too. For years I had been the invisible one, the scapegoat the girl whispered about in pity or disdain. But in that moment at the dinner table, I wasn't invisible anymore. My words had cut deeper than their insults ever had, because mine were true. Back home, I stood on the balcony overlooking the ocean. The waves roared as though echoing the storm in my chest. For so long, I had wanted them to acknowledge the harm, to admit they were wrong, to give me something that resembled closure. But closure, I realize now, doesn't come from the people who broke you. It comes when you decide to stop bleeding for them. And I had stopped. In the weeks that followed, the calls came again. My brother furious. You embarrassed them in front of everyone. My aunt pleading. They're old. Just let it go. My mother soft-voiced. Come home, let's start fresh. But I didn't answer. I let their words collect in the voicemail box like echoes in an empty cave. They wanted me back in the role I had played all my life, the obedient daughter, the quiet scapegoat, the one who absorbed the blows so everyone else could stay comfortable. I had outgrown that part. Instead, I poured myself into something greater. I began funding programs for young women like me, those dismissed as failures, mocked for not fitting their family's mold, cast aside when they didn't shine the way others expected. I met girls who had been called worthless, uneducated, unwanted. And I told them the words I had once needed to hear. You are not trash. You are not nobody. You are enough. Each time I spoke those words, it felt like I was healing the child inside me who had never heard them. Then came the article. One of the scholarships I had funded made headlines when a recipient, a brilliant young woman from a broken home, was accepted into a top medical school. The local paper ran her story, and in it she mentioned my name. She said I wouldn't be here if not for the woman who believed in me when no one else did. The article spread. Soon magazines wanted to interview me. My face appeared in glossy spreads, my story told and retold, the girl who had been cast out, who had built a fortune, who now gave back to those the world had overlooked. And with the attention came the inevitable. My parents could no longer hide. People in their community whispered. Their friends asked questions. They could no longer pretend I was the failure, the embarrassment, the nobody. The world knew the truth. One afternoon I received a letter in the mail. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. My father's. I unfolded the paper slowly, my hands trembling even though my heart was steady. We saw the article. People are talking. Maybe we didn't handle things the right way. Maybe we were too harsh. But family is family. You belong with us. Come back. There it was again, the half apology, the veiled command, the attempt to reel me back into their orbit. Maybe we didn't handle things the right way, the understatement of a lifetime. I set the letter down and laughed, not out of joy, but out of the absurdity of it. For years they had called me worthless. Now because the world saw my worth, they wanted to claim me again. The next family gathering I attended wasn't out of obligation, it was out of choice. I walked into the hall with my head high, cameras flashing as reporters followed me, curious to capture the reunion. My parents were there, of course, stiff and smiling, desperate to appear united. My brother hovered nearby, his eyes narrowed, torn between jealousy and calculation. I took the microphone when it was offered and I spoke. Not to them, not for them, but for me. I once believed I was nobody, because the people closest to me told me so. But I stand here today as proof that no one has the power to define you except yourself. I was called trash, but I became treasure. I was cast out, but I built my own home. I was silenced, but now I will never stop speaking. The room erupted in applause, though I barely heard it. I wasn't speaking to them. I was speaking to the girl I had once been, the one who had walked barefoot into the night with nothing but pain in her chest and fire in her soul. After that night, my parents stopped trying to pull me back. The world had seen too much, heard too much. Their power over me was gone. What lingered was only the faint ache of what might have been the ghost of the love I had once craved. And yet I no longer needed it, because I had learned that revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes the greatest revenge is living so fully, so brightly that the shadows of your past can never touch you again. I had chosen myself, and that choice was enough. But life has a cruel way of circling back. Months later, I received another call from Adam. His voice was different this time, no arrogance, no anger, just fear. "Dad's not well," he said. "It's bad, you should come." I sat in silence for a long time after the call ended, the ocean waves crashing in the distance. Did I owe him my presence? Did I owe either of them anything? The child inside me whispered yes. The woman I had become whispered no. I stood on the balcony, the salt wind stinging my face, and realized the truth: I didn't owe them my presence. But maybe I owed myself closure. The hospital room was dimly lit, the steady beeping of machines filling the silence like a metronome of mortality. My father lay on the bed, thinner than I remembered, his once commanding frame reduced to frailty. His hair, once jet black, was streaked with gray, his skin pale and paper-thin. For the first time in my life, he didn't look like the man who had towered over me, barking commands and judgments. He looked human, breakable, mortal. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, my hands gripping the frame as if steadying myself against the weight of decades. My mother sat beside him, her eyes weary, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up at me, and for once there was no anger, no venom, just exhaustion. "You came," she whispered, the same words she had spoken in the ICU months ago. I nodded, stepping closer. "I came, but don't mistake this for forgiveness." My father stirred, his eyes fluttering open. When they landed on me, something flickered across them, surprise, maybe even regret. His voice was rough, weak. "Sarah." I waited for the words that had never come. The apology, the acknowledgement, something, anything. But all he said was, "Don't let them forget me." The plea struck me harder than all the insults he had ever thrown at me. Because in that moment I realized the truth, even on his deathbed. His greatest fear wasn't that he had hurt me. It was that the world would forget him. I leaned in, my voice low but steady. "They won't forget you. But they'll remember the truth, not the story you wanted them to believe." His eyes closed again, a tear slipping down his cheek. My mother reached for his hand, her shoulders trembling. For the first time, she didn't look like the woman who had shouted me out of her house. She looked like a wife facing the loss of the only man she had ever followed. I stayed until the machine slowed, until the room was filled with the stillness that only comes after the final breath. Then I stood, kissed his forehead gently, a farewell to the father I had wanted, but never had, and walked out. The funeral was a spectacle, as I knew it would be. My family loved appearances too much to let death dull their shine. They held the service in a grand church, flowers spilling over the pews, speeches lined up one after another about what a pillar of strength my father had been. I sat in the front row, my face composed, my heart a storm. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium. All eyes were on me, the daughter who had been cast out, the daughter who had become a story in her own right. I cleared my throat, my gaze sweeping the room. "My father was a man of conviction," I began. "He believed in strength, in discipline, in control. He shaped the lives of those around him with those values. And for many years I thought those values made me weak because I could never meet them the way he wanted." The room was silent. My mother's eyes were on me, wide and wet. But here is the truth. What he didn't realize was that every harsh word, every dismissal, every moment he told me I was nothing. Those moments didn't break me. They built me. Not in the way he intended, but in the way I needed. Because I learned that my worth doesn't come from anyone else's definition. It comes from me. Gasps rippled softly through the crowd. I pressed on my voice steady. "He once called me trash. He once told me to get lost. But I am standing here now as proof that nobody has the right to define who you are. Not even family, especially not family who fail to see you." I stepped back, the weight of my words settling over the room. Some faces were shocked, others approving. My mother's shoulders shook with quiet sobs. But I didn't stay to comfort her. My role was done. After the funeral, I returned to my home by the ocean. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the waves crashing endlessly against the shore. For the first time, I felt something close to peace. Not because I had forgiven everything, but because I had finally spoken the truth without fear. In the months that followed, I continued my work funding scholarships, mentoring, investing in lives that deserved more than what I had been given. Each life I touched, each girl who looked at me with hope in her eyes, felt like a piece of the revenge I had been denied. Not revenge of destruction, but revenge of creation. Because the best way to answer betrayal isn't to become bitter. It's to build a life so luminous that their shadows can't touch it. Sometimes when I walk along the shoreline at night, I hear my parents' voices in my memory. The insults, the dismissal, the anger. But they no longer sting the way they once did. They are echoes, now reminders of the person I was forced to become. I think about my father afraid of being forgotten. I think about my mother clinging to appearances even when the truth was breaking her apart. And I think about the girl I once was, the girl who believed them when they said she was nobody. To her I whisper into the night, "You are somebody, you always were." And to you listening to my story, I want you to take this with you. If you have ever been told you are worthless, if you have ever been silenced by the people who should have protected you, if you have ever been cast aside by those who were supposed to love you, know this: their words are not your truth. Your truth is in your survival. Your truth is in your resilience. Your truth is in the life you build despite them. I was called trash. I was told to get lost. But I became the woman who found herself. And so can you. If this story touched you, if it made you think of your own battles and scars, I ask you to stay with me. Like this video so it reaches others who need to hear it. Share it with someone who still feels unseen, who still needs hope. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories of betrayal, survival, and the strength we carry inside us. And please leave a comment. Tell me if you've ever been told you were nothing and how you proved them wrong, because your voice matters.